Good morning, everybody. Again, I'm David Rosenheim with the Climate Registry. Tom did a pretty good job of painting who we are. We focus on greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verifications, and we were founded and are governed by US states and Canadian provinces to provide support as those states set up both voluntary and mandatory greenhouse gas reporting programs. And we are here in Paris with a delegation of 7 US states, several of which are here with us today. So the topic of the day is to focus on the Clean Power Plan. And just to set this up, as many of you likely know, the US INDC is to reduce carbon pollution by between 26 and 28% by 2025 over 2005 level. And the Clean Power Plan accounts for about 10% of that. We're already about 10% towards meeting that goal. So the remaining parts of the reduction will be met by a combination of the Climate Action Plan and additional measures. But the Clean Power Plan really is the biggest game in town, and it's intended to regulate the US electric power sector, which accounts for about 40% of US emissions. And that sector under the plan is targeted for a 32% reduction by 2030 over 2005 baseline. But it's a federal regulation, but it's carried out by states. So it's up to each state to develop and implement a plan to comply with the rule. And those that don't will be handed a federal implementation plan. But well ahead of the Clean Power Plan, and for years, some US states have been taking increasingly aggressive action on climate and energy, and also transportation, as well as forming regional collaboratives, such as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or Reggie, the Pacific Coast Collaborative, WCI, within which California's cap-and-trade system functions, and even regional renewable energy credit markets. So this collection of regional collaborations, along with a range of measures that individual states have been taking or are planning to take moving forward, underpin and really give credibility to our ability to meet the national target. We're honored today to have with us former Governor Bill Ritter from the great state of Colorado to provide a few opening remarks. In the governor's current role, he runs the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University that is providing a lot of support to states as they develop their compliance plans in response to the Clean Power Plan. Please welcome Governor Ritter.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here. There's a great august panel here with 5 different speakers, so I'm going to just make some brief remarks. Governor Shumlin was unable to make it, so they asked me to fill in, and I'm happy to do that. I do work at Colorado State University now at the Center for the New Energy Economy. We work with states. I did that leaving the governor's office in 2011 with a sense that the United States Congress, the United States Senate was not going to act in a meaningful way on comprehensive energy policy. You didn't have to be a genius to sort of figure that out. You just had to understand the political winds. And so we began working with states. And so the role, my role today is to introduce this topic and just ask people to understand this critical role that states play. When we began our work and looking at states, we decided a couple of things. One, that we wanted to track every piece of legislation entered in the State House. So the State Senate, the State House, 3 years now, there have been 10,500 pieces of energy legislation entered in the 50 state legislatures across the country in just 3 years. Now, not all those became law. But if you look at the states, about 220 million people live in a state with a renewable energy standard. About 230 million people live in a state with an energy efficiency resource standard. So if it were its own country, just the states that have renewable energy standards or energy efficiency resource standards, would be the 5th biggest country in the world. In our state of Colorado, we have a 30% renewable energy standard. And if you look at what our main utility has done since 2005, between 2005 and 2020, they will reduce their emissions 35%. This is Xcel Energy, one of the primary utilities. So just kind of understanding that as a framework, no matter what you hear sort of from Congress, from the Senate, if you look to the states and follow the progress of the states, the work they're doing on energy legislation, and in turn, what that means with respect to both climate And what it means with respect to emissions, you can see that the United States is on track to do some very significant things. The Clean Power Plan is really part of our topic today, or the topic today, and so I work now convening 13 Western states on the Clean Power Plan, but also work with the Nicholas Institute at Duke University, Georgetown Climate Center, Vicky Arroyo's group, and then the Great Plains Institute, and I think we cover probably something like 44 out of the 48 lower states, not Alaska nor Hawaii, which did not get targets, but I think we have all but about 4 or 5 of those states covered in our convenings and working with them and getting to a place where we get this 32% emissions reduction by 2030. It is sort of the biggest part of the President's climate action plan. And again, while the United States Congress, while members of the Congress, while members of the Senate will say a variety of things about sort of their unwillingness to develop climate policy, even states that are part of the lawsuit are actively participating in convenings to look at implementation should they lose the lawsuit. So, you know, it's going to be what the courts decide ultimately is going to sort of be the big question. But the interesting thing is there are constructive convenings around the United States with all of these states participating where we're having conversations about how we actually get there. The EPA did a very good thing in making the rule flexible so that there are a variety of things states could take into consideration, look at different models for how they might want to ultimately implement the plan. There are also ways for states to participate in sort of regional trading platforms if they want. There's trading-ready platforms, both for rate-based and mass-based, without getting too weedy about this. The good news is states are looking at that, and states are having that model. And even states where, you know, there may be a variety of states that actually are, where their leadership may be vocal about being opposed to the EPA's plan, about actually wanting to undermine the authority of the EPA to do this altogether, but those states are still involved in trying to understand how to implement this. So we go forward, the courts uphold it, the Clean Power Plan will be at the center of what the United States of America is able and willing to do to get to its goal of reducing emissions 32% by 2030. I'm going to end there because, as I say, there's a group of people that are actually doing this hard work at the state level and really understand the nuts and bolts of it. But I think it's why I walk around these halls with such great optimism as an American. In spite of whatever may be coming out of Washington, D.C., there is a great reason for hope with all of the people working throughout the United States at the state level on ensuring that we are paying attention to climate, we're paying attention to emissions, and there's so much being done that there is great reason for optimism. So with that, David, thanks for the opportunity, and I wish you good luck with your panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Governor Ritter. Okay. So we can save more time for conversation. I'm just going to state each speaker's name and position and really ask you each to, in your opening remarks, to focus on your state's response or potential response as you prepare your plans for the Clean Power Plan. I do want to leave as much time as possible for audience participation. So first, I'd like to introduce the chairman of the California Air Resources Board and a true leader and pioneer in climate policy, and also a member of my board's executive committee, Mary Nichols.
Thank you, David. I want to start off by acknowledging the terrific role that Governor Ritter and his center have played as conveners of Western states to talk about how we will move forward under the Clean Power Plan. These conversations began before the plan was even officially proposed and have carried us through to the final rule in a way that has made sure that the interests of states were considered and incorporated in ways that I don't think any previous federal rulemaking has ever done. So even before we have the implementation phase done, we already are on a path that allows for states to have a much more significant role and more flexibility in how we go about doing our implementation plans. And that really reflects the experience of not only Colorado, but of other states in, over the years, struggling with, in some cases, but overall achieving terrific results on the air quality front. under the Clean Air Act. So we have the basis to move forward. California is one of those states that has intervened in support of the Clean Power Plan, and we are vigorously supporting it for a couple of reasons, one of which is that we believe it's good for the country and that there will be major benefits from a health perspective as well as climate. But another of these is, very frankly, our own self-interest, and that is because as we have moved forward towards a greater percentage of renewable electricity in our state portfolio, we now have periods of time when California has excess solar energy that we could be exporting if we had a more effective regional electricity market. So we have become major advocates for regional plans. Now, having California being in favor of something isn't always the best way to get it sold in other parts of the West. And so that's one of many reasons why we were really grateful that that the Ritter Center was able to step up and start this process and to put it in an academic and a more neutral kind of setting. But California's many years of investing in energy efficiency and renewables as well as pollution control has put us in a strong compliance position. We are required under the plan to achieve a target which is actually higher than where we expect to get under our current program for implementing the California Clean Air Act. So in that respect, we feel like we can take it easy, but we can't really, because there are a lot of procedural aspects to doing a SIP amendment as required that we will still have to go through. And we are looking at designs that will allow for our cap and trade program to fit neatly within the federal rule while it continues to support our own state targets as well. I think I'm going to stop with that because I think each of these states has something unique to contribute, and it's probably more important that we have the conversation. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Nichols. I'd next like to welcome Commissioner Bob Martineau, who oversees the Tennessee Department of Environmental Conservation, which also houses the state's energy office. So he has, and Tennessee's in a bit of a unique situation, which I'm sure he'll describe. Commissioner?
Thank you, David. Appreciate your convening this group and want to commend everyone who's working. As Governor Ritter noted, that sort of between the coasts, lots of activity going on, whether one politically agrees or not with the Clean Power Plan. The states are, in almost all cases, moving forward to develop a plan to meet the target set in the Clean Power Plan, and EPA, worked, I think, extensively and perhaps in an unprecedented manner in outreach to the states, for which Gina and Janet McCabe commended for in developing that proposal, and then listening to comments during that between proposal and final to hear the state and other stakeholders' inputs. And we're relatively unique in our state in that we have a single utility provider that's a quasi-federal government agency, and it has been, with their integrated resource planning, looking really over the last 10 years as they've looked not only at CO2 but other criteria pollutants to how to transition to a cleaner energy economy. So they've made substantial reductions in their coal-fired capacity by shutting down in many cases, and in some cases converting to gas, but moving away and looking at additional. We have about 15% of our capacity is hydroelectric, and we're about 35% still coal-fired, but that was about 60+% less than a decade ago. So there have been substantial reductions between 2005 and 2012. They had already reduced CO2 emissions by about 30%. So we're well on the way as a path, and really correspondingly, of course, the criteria pollutants that go with that. So they're looking at the plan and we're working with them to transition to that next phase to meet the Clean Power Plan goals. In the next 3 years, they're actually scheduled to take down another 5,000 megawatts of coal-fired capacity, which I think is the single largest conversion of decommissioning of coal-fired capacity that'll happen in the next few years. With that transition to zero carbon sources and some conversion to natural gas. So they're looking at the plans, and that's the kind of efforts that we're making at the state level to transition that. And obviously, the Clean Power Plan is the core part of what the activities are now, because the federal plan focusing on the electric utility sector. But as you noted, that's about only the 30-some% of the total CO2 emissions. So looking with the federal government, other things that address other sectors, methane and the transportation sector, that are still a large component. So I'll stop there and let the others, so we can get into the dialogue.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. It sounds like there's a tuba warming up out there. So I'll ask the speakers to speak loudly so we can overpower whatever is going on next door. This is kind of the open nature of the COP, which makes it fun. I'd next like to welcome Commissioner Ann McCabe from the Illinois Commerce Commission, which is Illinois, among other things, regulates the utilities in Illinois, serves as the state's PUC. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Again, Ann McCabe with Illinois. It's great to be here as a member of the Climate Registry Board. Each state is unique. Illinois has a number of utilities. We're about 50% nuclear, the largest nuclear generation state in the country, about 40% coal. We have an energy efficiency portfolio standard and a renewable portfolio standard, and are about in the middle of a 10-year plan to implement grid hardening and smart meters. We're also a restructured state with retail electricity competition, which means we don't control the generation. Illinois is reviewing the Clean Power Rule and determining potential compliance pathways. Modeling is being done by the regional transmission organizations and a number of other entities. This modeling and additional analysis will really help the states determine which path they want to take, mass or rate-based. For the last 2 years, Illinois has been part of at least two or more regional groups. One's called MSEER. It's the Midwest State Environmental and Utility Regulators, who've been meeting to talk about a multi-state compliance strategy. As others have alluded, the Clean Power Plan has brought together the utility and environmental regulators who haven't traditionally worked together in the past. The utility regulators understand energy efficiency. They often oversee the utility's energy efficiency programs and the transmission system. So we're helping learn from each other. And there's also a Midwest Power Collaborative, which are the states, NGOs, and the utilities who are also discussing multi-state compliance. And more recently, a group of PJM states, which spans the Chicago, ComEd region, all the way to the east, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and that's chaired by Michigan and Virginia.
Thank you, Commissioner. So I just want to point out maybe the obvious, which is that we're kind of privileged here to have a real mix of perspectives, not only from the different states, but from different roles within each state. Chairman Nichols oversees a very large air resources agency that oversees greenhouse gases, among other things, in the state, that covers both greenhouse gas pollution generated from the power sector, as well as the transportation sector and other sectors. Commissioner Martineau similarly oversees all environmental programs and energy, but in a state where most of the energy is generated by a quasi-federal agency, the Tennessee Valley Authority. Commissioner McCabe oversees utilities in a deregulated state. And now we move to Ruchi Sadir, who is a senior advisor to Governor Kate Brown in Oregon on climate and energy. Ruchi?
Thanks, David, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate being on the panel to provide Oregon's perspective. As David mentioned, I'm the energy policy advisor to Governor Kate Brown in Oregon, and part of my role there is threefold. I provide advice on pending state legislation, policy at state agencies that they may already have existing authority to be creative. in tackling climate change issues. And then the third is advice on policy related to federal and regional initiatives like the Clean Power Plan and the Pacific Coast Collaborative. Just for some quick context, Oregon has about 4 million people. Half of those people live in the Portland metro area, so we're a much smaller state than our neighbors to the south in California and our neighbors to the north in Washington. And we've really benefited from the partnership on the West Coast with the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which includes British Columbia, because I think there's some interest in similar goals, but together we can, I think, accomplish more. And we've seen that firsthand. Another kind of point of context is within the energy sector, 85% of our greenhouse gas emissions, which includes electricity and transportation fuels, and about 8% is from agriculture. Within the electricity sector, our resource mix is about 40% hydroelectric power, so carbon-free, and then about 36% coal, which is inclusive of coal that is from other states, like Montana, Wyoming, and Utah, that comes into Oregon and is used over long-distance transmission lines, and about 17% natural gas. And then within the transportation resource portfolio, you're probably not surprised to hear that about 90% is petroleum-based, but we do have a pretty good renewable fuel standard, so 8% is ethanol. So just that's some context, I guess, to explain where Oregon is coming from. And we have had, as I mentioned, great collaboration in the Pacific Coast Collaborative, which has led to some initiatives that we have learned about from California and others. One in particular I'd like to highlight is the Clean Fuel Standard. That's a requirement for 10% of carbon intensity reduction in transportation fuels over 10 years. That is something that we have really benefited from in the Pacific Coast Collaborative. I think there's maybe 2 people working on this at the Department of Environmental Quality, but we've borrowed from the great state of California, where they think they have a team of 50 or so. And so there's information exchange that occurs. We've borrowed from their expertise in terms of what type of computer system to use, and in the future, perhaps we may be able to link systems. Part of the implementation of the Clean Fuels program expects a market-based mechanism where there's only a certain amount of blending that can occur to achieve that carbon intensity reduction. And so there will be a reliance on the generation of credits from zero-emission vehicles and public transit. And perhaps in the future, there could be a market regime through that shared computer system. In terms of the Clean Power Plan, Oregon is also pretty well positioned to comply. We've made a lot of investments and feel as though that Oregon has been a leader in clean energy policy and technology, which has put us in a place that demonstrates that as business as usual progresses, or if business as usual progresses, we would be below the target that EPA has set for Oregon, which puts us in an interesting position, I think, for considering collaboration with other states. As I mentioned earlier, we have coal that is generated from states that are far away, but we have the potential to do energy efficiency and other mechanisms that we have pioneered for a number of years. An example of that is we've had, since 1999, a 3% public purpose charge, which is a dedicated fund to pursue energy efficiency measures among our 2 largest electric companies and our 2 largest natural gas companies. It's to the point where the Portland General Electric Integrated Resource Plan demonstrates a very low need for increased resources, supply side, for the next 10 years, and any kind of incremental demand that might be needed has likelihood and requirement to be met through energy efficiency. So essentially get rid of the demand itself. We also have a renewable portfolio standard of 25% by 2025. There's interest in increasing that to 50%. There's a lot of discussion for the next legislative session to consider that, in addition to a potential cap and trade program that will be introduced in the legislature next session as well. And then one point that I think is really interesting is since the 90s, Oregon has considered the risk of environmental regulation in determining what type of resource planning should occur. So our one and only remaining coal plant in Oregon, the Boardman coal plant, will be shutting down 20 years early. And that's a huge decision that was made because of investments in pollution control technology and consideration of future carbon risk. And those costs and risks together made more sense to shut it down 20 years early rather than putting in additional costs and extending the life of it. So those are all things I think that Oregon has done to invest in our future and put us in a good place to comply with the Clean Power Plan. But that still means that we have an opportunity to have lower cost emissions over a broader set of states through the region. And we look forward to working through the Pacific Coast Collaborative and through groups like Governor Ritter's group to see whether those partnerships can occur. In the past year, we've been doing a lot of outreach with our stakeholder groups. 3 agencies have been working together really well. The Department of Environmental Quality, which is the lead agency with the primary authorities, but along with the Public Utility Commission and our Oregon Department of Energy. Those 3 agencies have been looking at scenario planning and have been getting a lot of support from regional groups to see whether there could be partnerships in the future to get the lowest cost emission reductions across our broader region. And then finally, I'll mention, again, hearkening back to our friends to the south in California, there's an energy imbalance market, which has been really fascinating to watch. The idea there is that we have variable generation that could be better used if we can have a broader set of generation facilities to balance it with. And so PacifiCorp, which is a large investor-owned utility in the West, has been participating in that quite successfully. Portland General Electric, which is the largest investor-owned utility in Oregon, is also examining whether that could be a future for them. And then there's also interest in studying the joining of those 2 utilities with the California ISO, which has been an ongoing analysis. And so I think this all demonstrates that we are in a region, our electrons don't pay attention to state boundaries, and neither should we. In terms of trying to figure out the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you very much, Reggie. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Deb Markowitz, who is Secretary of the Vermont Natural Resources Agency and also a board member of Reggie, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So Vermont is exempt from the Clean Power Plan, but Reggie is a primary vehicle, and welcome you to talk about it.
Well, thank you. I really am here to talk a little bit about Reggie, and for folks who aren't aware of it, we've had a regional greenhouse gas initiative in place now for 7 years, and it's 9 states from the Northeast region and Mid-Atlantic. And together, what we do is we regulate producers of carbon, electric producers of carbon that are producing over 25 megawatts. So it's the larger producers, not some of the really small plants, but the larger plants. And we require them to have one Reggie allowance for every ton of carbon they emit. Through that system, over these past 7 years, we have reduced carbon emissions by 40%, and we expect to be at 50% by 2020. So in the context of the Clean Power Plan, the participants of Reggie will all meet their goals using Reggie as the compliance mechanism. That sounds really simple. As a practical matter, it's much more complicated, and that's because each of our states are somewhat different, and our as we write our compliance plans, it's really it hasn't been done before to have sort of a multi-state effort reflected in an individual state's compliance plan. So we're really taking a close look at the nuances of Reggie. Reggie, for those of you who are wonks and have studied the Clean Power Plan, you might notice that Reggie covers plants that aren't covered in the Clean Power Plan. That's one of the complications. And so we don't want to disrupt our program entirely by changing it so that it's in lockstep with the Clean Power Plan. So there are some questions out there. I think the interesting question, though, the most interesting question facing us in Reggie right now is what does it mean that we expect, and we're hopeful, that other states begin to develop market-ready approaches? what is the opportunity and the challenges in linking our successful market with others? And understand, we're all a little antsy about it because this has brought in each of the first 3 periods of the program, $1.6 billion of economic benefit to our states. So it's over $3 billion of economic benefit to our states. And what happens is when we auction off these credits, we have auctions 4 times a year, we take that money and we reinvest it in efficiency. Every state does it a little differently. In Vermont, we invested in thermal efficiency, so weatherizing houses, particularly focused at low and moderate income Vermonters. And that creates additional economic benefit in our states, as well as greenhouse gas emission savings. So it's been a very successful program in our, for our local economies as well. And the market is getting better and better. We actually just had an auction that we reported out last week. The prices are very strong. There is we look at who are buying these credits, right? So the entities that we're regulating, of course, buy a bunch of them, but there are other investor entities that buy the credits as well, the allowances as well, because they'll sell them maybe, not maybe, definitely at a higher price at a later date. Now, we don't allow them to accumulate for too long. We require the retirement of those allowances because, of course, that could create a distortion both of the market and as well as the goal of reducing greenhouse gases. So this is an exciting time. I want to make one other comment. Building on something that Ruchi talked about in her state, which is that they're retiring a coal plant 20 years early. And I expect, even though we're going to see litigation, and I know as I've spoken with folks from other parts of the world, people are always amazed at our litigious society and how you can really wrap things in lawsuits and create delays for many, many years. For those of you who feel cynical about that, let me tell you that the Clean Power Plan is sending a directional message to the market that is meaningful. And because of some other clean air regulations, our coal-fired plants have to spend significant money to come up to other pollution standards that have already been through litigation. And those investments are not insignificant, and you will see more and more coal plants closing because of an unwillingness to make the bet that at the end of the day they're going to win this lawsuit with the Clean Power Plan. So even with litigation slowing down implementation, we're going to see, I believe, significant greenhouse gas benefits across the United States. And maybe I'll end there on the positive note.
That's great. I am absolutely itching to ask questions, but I am going to actually open it up to the floor. I might jump in with one in a few minutes. Gentleman in front.
Please introduce yourself.
I'm William McPherson with the Unitarian Universalist Association. That's a long title. And I'm also a resident of Seattle, Washington. And some of you may know that in Washington we have something called Carbon Law, which is an initiative to impose a carbon tax of $25 per ton. We have a neighbor to the north, was mentioned earlier. British Columbia has imposed a carbon tax and effectively reduced emissions by about 30% without damaging the economy, which is a very important point we always make. We're also part of the Pacific Coast Initiative with Oregon and Washington, and California. Well, you're not Washington, California. And we're very proud of the work we've been doing together with the whole West Coast. I wanted to ask you one thing because I'm talking too long now. Are you aware of the problem of coal and oil export, which is really impinging on our states? I know that Oregon is well aware because of the LNG, the gas export, but what about coal and oil?
Before you answer that, I just want to say to anyone watching over the live stream, you can get your questions in using the hashtag AskUSCenter.
Okay. Ruchi, do you want to take that?
I'm
It's on.
okay. I know about the LNG export facility proposals and pipelines associated with it, and I know that at least in Oregon right now, there's some permitting that's required on the federal side, and before that process is done, we've, from the Oregon perspective at least, have been waiting to see where that comes out. There are some interesting discussions being made and questions about life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas, which I think is worthy of exploration. And we don't have any natural gas development in our state, but you're right, there is questions related to what is the impact of having that transport and that export facility. There's a lot of, I think, interesting discussion and analysis that's taking place, but at this point, at least in Oregon, for the projects that you're mentioning, we're waiting to see what the FERC decision is before moving forward. Right, and the sort of trade-offs between exporting to Asian markets where there might be coal or displacing coal potentially versus what are the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of the natural gas and the transport greenhouse gas emissions as well. And I think that you might have some.
Well, I want to commend you for the question. I mean, there is a really important discussion that we have to have about leaving carbon in the ground. And we haven't barely begun that conversation. So I'll acknowledge that straight up. And as folks in government, that conversation doesn't happen at our level. It begins with the people and then goes to the legislature. And but it is the right it is the right question to be asking. In the same way, there's a lot of conversations about carbon tax rather than a market-based approach. And we know that economists and policymakers debate whether or not it would be more effective to simply go right to a carbon tax. That's obviously can be much more disruptive in the economy, and so it's much more complicated to move to as a matter of public policy. We are indeed in the New England states having some general conversations about what that could look like. There's no real action yet. I mean, it's again years from now, and in part we have a market-based approach, which is been very successful for us. The next step we're looking at is whether or not there's a way to expand it to transportation fuels, to home heating fuels, because like a lot of the other folks sitting up here, half of our carbon emissions comes from mobile sources. And so we are not going to get it through Reggie unless we think about whether or not there's an opportunity for an additional market. These are very difficult questions, and I really encourage you and your colleagues to continue to raise it, bring in the economists, bring in the conversation, get it into our legislators.
Rob?
Thank you. Thank you, David. My name is Robert Kay. I work for ICF Consulting in LA. I'm here proudly supporting Pacific Island delegations. And through you, David, I'd like to ask the panelists to explore a little bit about the mechanics of how states can collaborate under the Clean Power Plan.
If I can just put a finer point on that, thank you very much, Rob. And maybe take it in a direction of the potential for collaboration around market mechanisms. And there's different examples of this. Secretary Markowitz already gave a great overview of Reggie. So a question to you might be the exportability of the Reggie model. I know that a few months ago, that was a hot topic. Do you expect uptake from other states?
Well, so the Reggie model is a really good one. It's complicated for us to think about bringing new states into it. And we're looking at that. We're actually, working with some consultants to see what that could look like. And it's complicated because we're already midstream. We've already required our folks to have reductions. We've already achieved a certain level of greenhouse gas reduction. And so the question is, how do people enter into our market? And my hope is that there's a way. I do expect that the Clean Power Plan, though, is going to get other states to take a look at becoming market ready. And the way the federal law operates is states can choose to become market ready, and then there can either be a federal market, and then the question is, does Reggie jump on as part of that, and maybe the California market as well, and you could probably speak to that in a minute. I really commend EPA. They did a tremendous job thinking through a very, very complicated system. I would believe that there's no other federal rule that's had to deal with every state operating so entirely differently, and that it's complex, because it's not just air pollution, it's energy generation, it's energy distribution. It's a lot of systems at once, but they have set up in this law an ability for states to simply be market ready, and then have the creation of a federal market that folks can join on.
Thank you, Secretary. Chairman Nichols.
I was just going to say that there was an announcement recently from Governor Cuomo that he was interested in linking with California. We don't have a Reggie type market. We have a cap and trade system that covers 85% of our economy, including motor vehicle fuels and heating fuels, as well as the electricity sector. So we face a significant set of issues there, including what happens with Reggie, because I don't think New York intends to abandon its key role within Reggie as a part of this either. So we're going to be talking soon about what linkage really means and whether there are measures short of what you might think of as a vast market in one commodity that can be used to still achieve greater efficiencies. We've been thinking about these a lot. The energy imbalance market that was mentioned earlier, I think, is a good example of a type of a new tradable commodity that now exists as a result of having a grid operator that was inventive about coming up with it, that now is attracting attention from utilities outside of California. And as we proceed to bring in the utilities from other states that are located in other states, their public utilities commissions are going to also want to have a say in how this works. And so we see ourselves moving in the direction of much greater collaboration, certainly now on an informal basis, but eventually formally in how the grid is operated, which is very much the way the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has wanted us to go for years, because it is a much easier way of assuring region-wide reliability if you actually have people formally in some way or another committed to doing more than just stepping in a case of emergency or backing each other up. But this is it's a really hot new world, I would say, in an area of economic policy that hasn't exactly been considered vibrant in the past. There's a lot of interesting things happening now in the world of electricity.
Commissioner McCabe, yeah. Thank you.
One of the concepts that grew out of a lot of the Midwest and other state collaborations was the concept of trading ready or common elements. And the benefit of trading ready is it doesn't require formal compacts between the states. Any state could trade with another state as long as they both are using the same compliance system, which, say, is mass-based or rate-based. By working with other states, it will greatly lower the overall costs, because power plants in one state can buy or sell credits with plants in another state. So it has a lot of appeal, and that will definitely increase collaboration, especially if you don't have to have a formal agreement. So I see that as that's in the final rule. It was not in the proposed rule, and that's going to be very interesting to follow.
So I want to turn to Commissioner Martineau and Rucci, but I want to add one potentially. I want to add potentially to the complexity of this, which is that right. So we have different cap and trade systems working in California and in Reggie, and those are both compliance vehicles for the Clean Power Plan, as has been described. There are also modular approaches, regional energy, REC markets, renewable energy crediting markets that already exist. There's an effort underway led by Tennessee, and Oregon is also collaborating, and it's something that the Climate Registry is supporting, which is an effort to look at an energy efficiency tracking and trading system. And that's work that's being funded by the Department of Energy, and that could support compliance efforts with state plans. So there are these mass-based cap and trade approaches, and then there are also modular approaches that might work better in a rate-based scenario. So, Commissioner, perhaps you can touch on these.
Thanks, David. And that was actually one of the things I was going to mention. I think one of the things about the way the final Clean Power Plan was developed, as Ann said, is it's trading ready. But we don't have to think about the only way of state collaboration and partnerships to work is through some kind of Reggie market at a sort of lower level or a different level, really not lower, but different way. The energy efficiency, many states are really focusing on that as you know, obviously the best way to help reduce your greenhouse gas emissions and other emissions is not to need the demand for that power. So looking at ways to track and verify energy efficiency and collaborating so you're all speaking the same language and so you can develop that as part of your compliance plan, then that's been up to this point, one of the real challenges is how do you take energy efficiency measures and quantify those into something in terms of a part of your compliance plan. But the other thing is, without a formal regional trading program, I think you're going to see a lot of sort of one binary, you know, kind of agreements between states. For example, in our state, and our utility was looking at renewable energy and wind power. We're not where we are. Wind power is not very cost effective and able. Just the geology or the meteorology and stuff. But there's a lot of wind in the Midwest, so we're actually working with. And the utilities working with developing a relationship to generate the wind power and then transmit it to our state. So those kind of contractual and agreements to help people comply and reduce their carbon emissions and find renewable energy sources, even where it may be physically not possible to do as effective, as cost effective. So you can drive the cost efficiencies down instead of saying, oh, we've got to develop our own wind power here. Well, where's the most cost effective way of somebody who has the ability to transmit it to you? And that may be the most cost-effective solution for a state. So there'll be, you know, ideally some kind of agreement between those two states. Is it going to be a regional trading thing? No, but it'll be a negotiated agreement between the generator and that state and how those credits are going to be used and where the generation is actually used at the end of the transmission line. So I think you'll see a lot of that. And as Deb says, to EPA's credit, that by setting up the final rule to also allow those kind of trading-ready things, you'll see probably much less formal than Reggie type things because those also take a long time to set up. Reggie took a long time to sort of put in place and was complicated. So if people want to move forward, they'll do some of these things. And then down the road, it may lead to more formalized expansion of Reggie type trading programs as that the comfort level rises and people are willing to move to that next level.
Reggie?
I agree with most of what you said, so I'll take it in a different direction, I guess, at least at first. I think that what I've seen, maybe even ruminations of that here, but at the legislature, I have seen a lot of people come together and agree on the outcome that they want to do. They want to engender greenhouse gas emission reduction because of climate change. And the conversation often breaks down when it comes down to the question of who pays for it and how much it's going to cost. And when you look at market mechanisms that can bring down the overall cost of greenhouse gas emissions, I think that you have a greater likelihood of getting consensus support for legislation or movement forward. And so this is mostly to highlight that these are really important discussions, that when you have more opportunities for market-based mechanisms, whether it be through a rate-based system of implementation with a REC market or renewable energy credit market or these new sort of markets potentially of energy efficiency credits that can be traded, you find the lowest cost way to solve a global problem. And so, our state has not taken a position on whether to go mass-based or rate-based. We're doing some scenario planning to figure out what the best for Oregon will be. But when that decision is made, we'll start to see, I think, who the partners can be, because there needs to be alignment between the decision of rate or mass-based. And to highlight as well, my agreement with Bob is one of the biggest things that Oregon talked about in our letter to EPA on the draft rule was that we probably can't do Reggie. And we need more options for market-based mechanisms that can be implemented in the West, which has, in Oregon at least, no ISO, no RTO. There's 30-some balancing authorities in the state alone. So it's a pretty complicated place to try to do something like a Reggie. So having this opportunity to have greater flexibility in developing a market-based mechanism that could lead to lower cost greenhouse gas emission reductions is something that we found to be really important, or appreciative that EPA made changes to the final rule to accommodate that.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Good morning. Ed Miller with the Joyce Foundation based in Chicago. Many people may have noticed that the political support from utilities may be really important to getting effective clean power plan implementation through in different states. Perhaps have any of the interested speakers comment on AEP, American Electric Power, announcing that they were pulling out of ALEC this week. And that they want to support clean power plan implementation in Ohio, where they're headquartered, and other states where there may be some political opposition to the clean power plan. So I don't know if that's relevant to any of your work.
Anyone?
I did see the announcement. I was very excited. We've seen a lot of support from the utilities that are California-based. Of course, you would expect that being subject to our existing AB 32 regime and being comfortable with now living in a cap-and-trade world, that they would see opportunities in the Clean Power Plan, and they do. Several of them, including Pacific Gas and Electric, the largest utility in our part of the world, are intervening actually in the litigation to defend the Clean Power Plan, as well as going forward with compliance. And I think that's a key step. It's not just a matter of will they comply, will they cooperate and quietly say, yeah, we can do this, but will they actually go out front in a politically charged context and say, yes, this is the right way to go. And I think we are seeing more utilities being willing to step up to the plate and say this is the right thing to do. And that's going to be very helpful.
So across the country, there are a lot of different kinds of utility entities. And, some are fully regulated, some are state-run, some are private. And in Vermont, although we've got a regulated utility system, we do have these, companies, who their goal is to make a profit. And I think what we've seen here by the example that you raise is that our utilities will be very successful in the conversion to renewables, that they can economically make money for their shareholders with this conversion. And so I thought that was fabulous news. It provided a great direction for the rest of the sector. For those of you who aren't aware of it, ALEC, which they moved out of, is a sort of a Republican think tank that supports very conservative action on these environmental issues, and so I thought that was
in state
really
legislatures.
Terrific.
They focus on states.
I'm sorry. Yeah, they're focusing on state legislatures, not the national, and so I thought that was really quite meaningful.
Any other quick thoughts on this question? So we're down to 5 minutes, which means it's time for the lightning round. 5 minutes for 5 people, and I want to take it maybe out of the Clean Power Plan context for a second. We're here, our delegation in its last day or second to last day. We have 7 states, 5 of which are with us here. Mary, you've been to many COPs. Some of you, this is your first COP or second COP. I'd like your perspective on the process in general and perhaps just touching on the role of states and subnational governments.
So I'll start on this end. Well, coming out of Copenhagen, folks were really disappointed that the national governments didn't step up to set some binding limits, and it created a vacuum that I think we've seen the states fill. States have really stepped up, taken action on climate, and I think our participation and the fact that so many of our governors are here as well and doing so many events is a sign that it's appreciated. It's a much more optimistic year. I do believe we're going to come out with something meaningful, and yet the states' roles will be ever more important to show that we can achieve these goals, we can protect our communities from the impacts of climate change, and in fact, we must do that. So I go home with a real sense of urgency.
Thank you. Ruchi.
This is my first COP, so I guess I don't have anything to compare it to, but based on what everyone else has told me, this has been great, and I agree. I feel like when I wrote back to my governor in my weekly report on day 2, I said 3 adjectives: hope, excitement, and learning. And those were the things that I had gathered in 2 days only. And so now that I'm towards the end of my week, that's only been in more so. I feel like not only with our group and our delegation, there's been a lot of learning that we can pass on good policy mechanisms to our own states, but even the countries themselves. I wandered over to the Japan pavilion and was really impressed with how much they're doing on energy storage and offshore wind, which are quite expensive in our markets, but the investments that they're doing on research and development could be shared broadly across the world. It's been very exciting for me, and I really hope that there will be good resolution on the international front on the agreement, and I think that it, at least from Oregon's perspective, given our experience with being a leader in clean energy and seeing that return in a lot of ways, been being well positioned to comply with the Clean Power Plan in an international context, I think that we'll feel similarly, and it'll keep us going for the next 10 or 20 years in terms of good policy.
Thank you. Commissioner?
This is my first COP also, and the one-word summary I'd have would be energizing. I'll also add, I think the Clean Power Plan will provide more impetus for increasing energy efficiency and renewable portfolio standards in many of the states, because those will be compliance strategies.
Great. Commissioner.
My first as well, and I think regardless of sort of the outcome of the negotiations, the active participation of the states here highlights, where, and the Clean Power Plan really, because it's really a state implemented mechanism, highlight the importance of as they're here, the subnationals, and in developing and implementing the policies they're going to make progress. And you can have the broad federal policy guidelines and directives, but it's really got to happen at the state level, whatever happens.
Thank you. Chairman, last word.
The first time I came to a COP was shortly after I was appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger to my current job. And I was there on behalf of the state of California, of course, but we were not even being spoken to, much less welcomed by the United States pavilion at that event. And then things changed rather quickly after that, and the State Department, ever since, I think, has recognized and acknowledged that many of the reductions that are going to be achieved are under the direct responsibility of states and local governments, and have provided not just a venue, but really a lot of support for our work. But this COP is certainly the best I've ever attended, primarily because it's so exciting to be here with a delegation that is being seen as making a contribution internationally to achieving a result. Under President Obama, we really have turned a corner in terms of the United States' role within the international community in driving towards a solution to the problem of global climate change. And in that regard, it's just been just a wonderful feeling to walk around as an American here.
Well, on that very positive note, we will break. Thank you very much for attending and participating. And thank you to our panel.